Arthur Reed stood at the edge of his cramped apartment in Silver Lake, staring at the crumpled callback notice in his trembling hand. After 8 years of bit parts, commercial auditions and waiting tables at overpriced restaurants on Sunset Boulevard, he'd finally landed something substantial. The role of Julian the Serpent Croft, California's most notorious serial killer, in an upcoming prestige drama for Paramount. "They want me," he whispered to the empty room, his voice catching. The late afternoon Los Angeles sun filtered through dusty blinds, painting golden stripes across walls, plastered with rejection notices and headshots of actors he'd once idolized. Men who'd made the leap he'd been chasing since arriving from Nebraska, with nothing but community theater experience and desperate ambition. Arthur's phone buzzed. His agent, Melody, her voice crackling with rare excitement. "This is it, kid. The director specifically requested you after your read. Said something about your eyes having the right kind of hunger, whatever the hell that means." "When do we start?" Arthur asked, already scanning his bookshelf for volumes on method acting, criminal psychology, anything that might help him inhabit the mind of a man who'd murdered 17 women across the state between 1972 and 1979. 3 weeks. They've got a consultant coming in, someone who worked the original case, and they're getting you access to the archives, Croft's personal effects. The whole method package. After hanging up, Arthur stood before his bathroom mirror, studying his unremarkable features. At 34, his window for breaking through was rapidly closing. He leaned closer, pushing his light brown hair back from his forehead, trying to find what the director had seen. What glimpse of Julian Croft had leaked through during his audition? The following morning, he found himself in a sterile conference room at the production office, facing a stack of manila folders and crime scene photographs that the consultant, a retired detective named Reeves, had brought. "These aren't copies," Reeves said, his weathered face grave beneath silver hair. "Special permission from the DA's office. Nothing leaves this room." He hesitated, fingers lingering on a particular folder. "Some of these images, they change you. You understand that, right?" Arthur nodded, already reaching for the first file. "I need to understand him. Completely." Across town in the office of the Los Angeles Chronicle, Eliza Mercer typed furiously, anger fueling each keystroke. The announcement of the Croft film had come 3 days earlier, and as the author of The Forgotten Lives Behind the Headlines, the definitive account of Croft's victims, she'd been fielding calls non-stop from producers seeking her expertise. "I'm not helping them turn that monster into a cultural icon," she told her editor, Marcus, who leaned against her desk with a resigned expression. At 42, Eliza had built her career on giving voice to victims, particularly women, who'd been reduced to footnotes in sensationalized crime coverage. "They're making it with or without you," Marcus replied, adjusting his glasses. "Wouldn't it be better to have someone in the room advocating for the victims?" Eliza's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Outside her window, downtown Los Angeles shimmered in the summer heat, a city built on dreams and reinvention, on stories. She'd spent 5 years researching Croft's victims, interviewing families still haunted by loss decades later. The thought of their trauma being transformed into entertainment made her physically ill. "I'll think about it," she finally said, though they both knew she'd already made up her mind. 2 weeks later, Arthur sat alone in his apartment, walls now covered with timeline charts, psychological profiles, and photographs of Croft at various stages of his life. He'd cut his hair to match the killer's distinctive style, adopted his specific brand of cigarettes, even started keeping the same strange hours. The production had arranged for him to visit Croft's childhood home in Bakersfield, now owned by an elderly couple who'd seemed disturbed by Arthur's intense interest in the property's history. That night he dreamed he was walking through a field of tall grass, hunting something. When he woke, drenched in sweat despite the air conditioning, he couldn't shake the feeling of exhilaration that had followed him from sleep. His phone rang, an unknown number. "Mr. Reed?" A woman's voice, cool and professional. "This is Eliza Mercer. I'm told you're playing Julian Croft in the upcoming film. Arthur sat up straighter, instantly recognizing her name. Ms. Mercer, I've read your book 3 times. Your insights into the victims. I'd like to meet, she interrupted. Before production begins, there are perspectives I think you should understand before you take on this role. The next day, they sat across from each other at a quiet cafe in Los Feliz. Eliza was striking in person, with direct grey eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they saw. She placed 17 photographs on the table between them. These are the women Julian Croft murdered, she said simply. Not as they appeared in police files or newspapers, but as they lived. Catherine was getting her master's in marine biology. Diane had just opened her own accounting firm. Rebecca coached her daughter's soccer team. Arthur studied each face, recognizing some from the case files. But these were different, vibrant, alive. Not victims, people. I'm not glorifying him, Arthur said quietly. I want to understand what creates someone like Croft. What human experiences twist into something so monstrous. And in that understanding, will you find something of yourself? Eliza asked, her voice softening slightly. That's what concerns me. The fascination we have with men like Croft, it comes at the expense of remembering those they destroyed. As she gathered her photographs, Arthur noticed the tremor in her hands. You have a personal connection to this, he realized aloud. Eliza paused. My aunt was Catherine Winters, victim number 6. As she left, Arthur felt something shift inside him. A realization that the role he was preparing for wasn't just a character study or career opportunity. It was an excavation into real trauma, real darkness. And as production approached, he couldn't help but wonder what that darkness might unearth within himself. Chapter 2. The first day of shooting dawned cold by Los Angeles standards, a marine layer hugging the coastline as Arthur arrived at the converted warehouse in Culver City. The set designers had meticulously recreated Julian Croft's basement workshop, where he'd constructed the elaborate traps that became his signature. The attention to detail was unsettling. The workbench arranged exactly as it had been in police photographs, right down to the precise placement of tools. Jesus, breathed Thomas, the director, a slender Chilean man with intense eyes and a reputation for drawing raw performances from his actors. You look transformed. Arthur knew what he meant. Over the past weeks, he'd lost 15 pounds, adopted Croft's distinctive gait, a slight forward lean as if perpetually pursuing something, and perfected the unsettling half-smile that had charmed victims and jurors alike. He'd even mastered Croft's habit of tilting his head when listening, like a predator locating prey. Let's start with scene 38, Thomas called, positioning Arthur before the workbench. This is intimate, just you and your craft, no dialogue. Show us the pleasure he took in his preparations. Arthur closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. The crew fell silent as he moved through the scene, hands caressing tools with disturbing tenderness, eyes alight with anticipation. Take after take, he refined the performance, each iteration more chilling than the last. "Cut!" Thomas finally called, his voice slightly hoarse. "That's extraordinary, Arthur. Take 15, everyone." In his trailer, Arthur stared at his reflection, searching for himself beneath Julian's mannerisms. The transformation had been almost too easy, as if Croft had been waiting inside him all along. This thought bothered him less than it should have. His phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "How's it going? Remember they're watching." He frowned, uncertain whether she meant the crew or the ghosts of Croft's victims. He didn't respond. The weeks blurred as production continued. Arthur inhabited Croft completely, staying in character between takes, speaking in Julian's measured cadence with its subtle Bakersfield accent. His co-stars began keeping their distance, unnerved by his intensity. Only Vanessa, who played Detective Marie Holt, the woman who'd eventually captured Croft, seemed willing to engage with him directly. "You're scaring people," she told him bluntly one evening as they waited for lighting adjustments. "Including yourself, I think." Arthur smiled Croft's smile. "It's just a role, Vanessa. Is it? Because you haven't been yourself in weeks. The comment lingered with him as they filmed the pivotal courtroom scenes, where Croft had famously defended himself with such charismatic eloquence that several jurors later admitted to momentary doubt despite overwhelming evidence. Arthur delivered the monologue in a single take, a performance so mesmerizing that even the extras playing jury members appeared genuinely swayed. "That's going to be your Emmy clip," Melody said afterward, squeezing his arm excitedly. "Everyone's talking about it." But Arthur barely registered her words. He was already preparing for the next day's scene, Croft's infamous television interview given after his conviction, where he'd spoken about his crimes with clinical detachment that had horrified and fascinated millions. That night, Eliza called him. "I watched the footage," she said without preamble. "The dailies that leaked online." Arthur sat up in bed, suddenly alert. "What footage?" "The courtroom scene. Your performance." She paused. "You're making him sympathetic, Arthur. You're making people want to understand him." "Isn't understanding important?" he countered, irritated by her tone. "Isn't that how we prevent men like Croft? Not if understanding becomes admiration, not if his charisma overshadows what he did." Her voice hardened. "I'm coming to set tomorrow. They've asked me to consult on the victim impact statements." After hanging up, Arthur paced his hotel room restlessly. The production had moved him here after neighbors in his apartment building complained about hearing him reciting Croft's court testimony at 3 a.m. The space felt anonymous, transitional, much like the motel rooms where Croft had stayed while hunting. On an impulse, Arthur pulled out his laptop and searched for the actual interview footage that they'd be recreating tomorrow. He'd watched it dozens of times during preparation, but something compelled him to see it again. The grainy video showed Croft sitting calmly in prison blues, hands folded neatly before him. "I selected them because they represented something," he was saying to the off-camera interviewer, a type of woman who believed the world owed her something. "I was merely correcting an imbalance." Arthur found himself mouthing the words in perfect synchronization, his body unconsciously mirroring Croft's subtle movements. When he eventually looked up from the screen, the bathroom door was slightly ajar, offering a partial reflection of himself. For one disorienting moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back. The next morning, he arrived on set to find Eliza deep in conversation with several actresses playing victims' family members. She acknowledged him with a curt nod, but maintained her distance. Throughout the day, he felt her watching him as he moved through scenes with practiced precision. During a break in filming, he approached her as she stood examining a prop evidence board. "You don't think I can separate myself from him?" he said quietly. Eliza turned, studying him with those perceptive grey eyes. "I think you're too good at what you do, Arthur. And I think there's a cost to that kind of immersion that you haven't considered. It's just acting, is it? You walk like him. You smoke like him. Yesterday, I watched you order lunch in his voice." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you know that you've started doing that thing with your hands? That gesture the survivors described? How he'd flex his fingers before attacking?" Arthur looked down, suddenly aware that his hands were indeed splayed in the distinctive manner documented in trial testimonies. He quickly clasped them behind his back. "You need boundaries, Arthur. Lines you won't cross for this role." Something in her concern irritated him, a presumption that he couldn't control his own performance, his own mind. "I appreciate your concern," he said, Julian's cadence slipping into his speech. "But I know exactly what I'm doing." As he walked away, Eliza called after him. "That's exactly what he said too, right before they arrested him." That night, filming ran late, the pivotal interview scene requiring multiple takes as Thomas demanded more nuance, more authenticity. By the time Arthur returned to his hotel, it was past midnight. Exhausted, he collapsed fully clothed onto the bed, Julian's words still echoing in his mind. He dreamed of standing in a clearing, watching a woman walk along a path below. In the dream, he felt nothing but cool interest, a detached appreciation for her movements. He woke suddenly, heart pounding, to find himself standing at the hotel window, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline. He had no memory of getting up. On his phone, a text notification glowed, early reviews of leaked footage praising his unnervingly authentic portrayal. The Hollywood Reporter was already predicting award nominations. His transformation was complete. Julian Croft was becoming his legacy, and somewhere in the darkness of his mind, Arthur Reed was disappearing. Chapter 3. The film was nearly finished when the first letter arrived. Plain envelope, blocky handwriting, postmarked from San Quentin State Prison. Arthur stared at it on his dressing room table, knowing without opening it who had sent it. Julian Croft, now 73, had been following news of the production with great interest, according to prison officials. Despite multiple interview requests from the filmmakers, he had maintained his silence until now. "You shouldn't open that," said Vanessa, who had stopped by to run lines. "Whatever's inside, it's a manipulation." Arthur nodded absently, but once she left, he carefully slit the envelope open with a letter opener. The paper inside was cheap prison stationery, covered with the same meticulous handwriting as the envelope. "Mr. Reed," it began, "I've been watching your journey into my skin with great interest. The clips that have emerged online show remarkable intuition on your part. You've captured something essential that others have missed, the liberation that comes with embracing one's true nature. I wonder if you've felt it yourself yet, that moment of perfect clarity." Arthur set the letter down, his hands unsteady. The words seemed to pulse on the page, an intimate whisper from a mind he'd spent months trying to inhabit. The letter continued for several pages, analyzing specific scenes with disturbing precision, offering corrections to small mannerisms, suggesting psychological insights that Arthur had somehow missed despite his exhaustive research. He should report this, he knew. Production had strict protocols about any contact from Croft, but something in the letter's final lines kept him silent. "We are not so different, you and I, artists, in our way. I recognized myself in your eyes the first time I saw your performance. Did you recognize me in yours?" 3 days later, they filmed the execution scene, a creative liberty, as the real Croft remained alive on death row. Arthur lay strapped to a gurney, IV lines extending from his arms, eyes fixed on the observation window where family members of his victims watched with solemn faces. "What I did was necessary," he said to camera, delivering Croft's fictional last words. "What I did made me immortal." "Cut," called Thomas, visibly moved. "Perfect, absolutely perfect." That evening, the cast and crew gathered at a downtown bar to celebrate the final week of shooting. Arthur arrived late, having spent hours in his hotel room rereading Croft's letter, searching for hidden meanings, clues to the man's psyche he might have missed. "There he is," Melody exclaimed, pulling him into the crowded space. "The man of the hour." Everyone wanted to talk to him, to touch him, to be in his orbit. He moved through the crowd with Julian's practiced charm, accepting congratulations with the same slight smile he'd perfected for the courtroom scenes. Only when Eliza appeared at his elbow did his performance falter. "Can we talk?" she asked, leading him to a quieter corner. Privately, she looked tired, shadows beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "I've been contacted by Catherine's daughter, my cousin. She's seen the promotional materials, heard about your performance." Eliza paused, choosing her words carefully. "She's concerned about how her mother will be portrayed. About whether this film will make Croft more famous than his victims ever were." Arthur felt a flicker of annoyance. "We've been respectful. We've shown the victims as real people, but they're still supporting characters in his story," Eliza interrupted. "That's the problem. No matter how well-intentioned, you're elevating him. Maybe it's time someone told his story properly," Arthur found himself saying, the words emerging before he could reconsider them. "Everyone's so quick to label him a monster, but what made him that way? The abuse he suffered, the systems that failed him. Are you seriously defending him right now?" Eliza stared in disbelief. He killed 17 women, Arthur. He tortured them. He kept souvenirs. Something cold settled over Arthur's features. I'm not defending his actions. I'm contextualizing them. There's a difference. Is there? Because you sound exactly like the fan mail he still receives. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You got a letter from him, didn't you? The prison confirmed he sent something to the production office. Arthur's silence was answer enough. What did it say? She pressed. That I understand him, Arthur replied, meeting her gaze steadily. That I've captured something essential about him that others missed. Eliza's expression hardened. And that flatters you. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Thomas, who pulled Arthur away for a toast. The moment broke, but Eliza's accusation lingered. Did it flatter him? The recognition from the man whose mind he'd spent months excavating. The following morning, Arthur woke to his phone ringing incessantly, Melody breathless with excitement. Have you seen it? The Hollywood Reporter piece. They're calling it the most transformative performance of the decade. They compared you to De Niro in Taxi Driver, Phoenix in Joker. Arthur sat up, disoriented. Beside his bed lay Croft's letter, which he'd fallen asleep reading again. That's great, he managed. Great? It's career-defining. You've got 3 meeting requests already this morning from major directors. Spielberg's people called Arthur Spielberg. After hanging up, Arthur checked his messages. Among the congratulations was a text from an unknown number. You've made him into exactly what he always wanted to be. A legend. Was it worth it? E. He deleted it without responding. The final day of shooting arrived, the discovery scene where Detective Holt finds Croft's workshop and the horrifying evidence within. Arthur wasn't scheduled to appear, but he came to set anyway, drawn by some inexplicable need to see the story's conclusion. He watched from the shadows as Vanessa moved through the set, her character piecing together the magnitude of Croft's crimes. When she uncovered the box of personal items taken from victims, her horror felt genuine, her tears real. That's a wrap, Thomas announced hours later to cheers and applause. Champagne appeared, speeches were made. Arthur accepted congratulations mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Later, alone in his hotel room, he found himself standing before the mirror, studying his reflection as he had that first day. The face looking back was both familiar and foreign. Julian's mannerisms now so deeply ingrained that he couldn't remember how he used to hold himself before the role. His phone chimed with a notification, an email from San Quentin. Another letter had arrived at the production office, this one addressed not to Arthur Reed, but to Julian. Something broke inside him then, a dam holding back months of accumulated dread. He grabbed his car keys and drove recklessly through the night to Eliza's address, which he'd seen on production documents. She answered the door in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, alarm crossing her face when she saw him standing there, disheveled and wild-eyed at 2 a.m. I can't find myself, he said simply. I've looked everywhere, and I'm not there anymore. For a long moment, she stared at him. Then, without a word, she stepped back to let him in. Inside, her apartment was cluttered with books and research materials. On one wall hung photographs, the victims in their lives, smiling, ordinary, human. Among them was a young woman with Eliza's grey eyes and determined jawline, Catherine. I think I've made a terrible mistake, Arthur said, his voice cracking. I wanted to understand him so badly that I let him colonize me, and now I don't know how to make him leave. Eliza's expression softened slightly. Sit down, she said, gesturing to the couch. Let me make some tea. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, they talked, really talked, for the first time. About boundaries and obsession, about the cost of art and the responsibility of storytelling, about whether understanding monsters makes us more human or less. The film premieres in 2 months, Eliza said eventually. What are you going to do? Arthur stared at his hands, Julian's hands, with their distinctive way of flexing and curling. I don't know, he admitted, but I can't be his ambassador. I can't let him use me to extend his legend. Then don't. she said simply. Refuse the press tour. Donate your salary to the victims' families. Tell people what it actually cost you to become him. Utter scene. As morning light filtered through the blinds, Arthur felt something shift inside him, not a complete return to himself, but a small step away from Julian's shadow. A beginning. "Will you help me?" he asked quietly. Eliza considered him for a long moment. "On one condition," she finally said. "We tell their stories too, all 17 of them, not as victims, but as women whose lives meant something before he took them." Arthur nodded, feeling the weight of Julian's presence recede slightly for the first time in months. "Where do we start?" "With their names," Eliza said, turning toward the wall of photographs. "Always with their names." Chapter 4. The night of the premiere arrived. The iconic Chinese theater on Hollywood Boulevard, transformed by spotlights and red carpet. Arthur stood in his hotel suite, adjusting his tie as stylists and publicists buzzed around him. The film, simply titled Serpent, had generated unprecedented buzz. Early screenings for critics had resulted in breathless reviews praising its unflinching portrayal of both Croft's brutality and charisma. "Cars waiting," Melody said, practically vibrating with excitement. "This is it, Arthur. Tonight changes everything." Arthur nodded absently, his gaze fixed on his reflection. In the 3 months since filming had concluded, he'd worked methodically to reclaim himself, changed his hair, gained back the weight he'd lost, spent hours with a movement coach to unlearn Julian's mannerisms. Still, sometimes he caught glimpses in mirrors, a certain tilt of his head, a familiar cold calculation in his eyes that suggested Julian remained, lurking beneath the surface. The premiere had been carefully orchestrated. At Arthur's insistence, the victims' families had been invited, given the same VIP treatment as the cast. A substantial portion of the film's profits would go to a foundation established in their names. These gestures felt insufficient to Arthur, but Eliza had assured him they mattered. Eliza. Their unlikely alliance had evolved into something neither had anticipated. Not romance exactly, but an intimate understanding born from shared trauma. His self-inflicted, hers inherited. She'd become his anchor as he navigated the treacherous waters between Arthur and Julian, between performance and possession. "Ready?" Melody asked, breaking into his thoughts. The red carpet was a gauntlet of flashbulbs and shouted questions. Arthur moved through it with careful deliberation, answering questions about his process with practiced responses that emphasized the research and preparation while avoiding romanticizing Croft's pathology. "There's a theory that playing villains allows actors to explore their own darkness," one reporter suggested. "Did you find that to be true?" Arthur paused, considering his words carefully. "I found that darkness isn't something you visit," he finally replied. "It's something that visits you, and sometimes it doesn't leave when you ask it to." Inside the theater, he was directed to his seat in the center of the front row. To his right sat Thomas and various executives. To his left, unexpectedly, was Eliza. "I didn't think you'd come," he whispered as the lights began to dim. "Someone needs to make sure you don't disappear again," she replied, her voice light, though her expression remained serious. The film unfolded before them, Arthur's transformation into Julian Croft even more disturbing when viewed as a complete narrative. The audience's reaction was palpable, a mixture of revulsion and fascination that mirrored society's relationship with true crime itself. During a particularly graphic scene depicting Croft's meticulous preparations, Arthur felt Eliza tense beside him. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, finding it cold and rigid. She didn't pull away. When the credits finally rolled, the theater erupted in thunderous applause. People turned toward Arthur, their faces reflecting admiration, awe, and something darker. The same fascination that had made Julian Croft a household name decades earlier. At the after-party in a converted downtown warehouse, Arthur found himself surrounded by industry elites, eager to discuss his brave performance, his fearless embodiment of evil. Each compliment felt like a small betrayal of the promise he'd made to himself, to Eliza, to the families watching from the periphery of the celebration. "Excuse me," he said abruptly, breaking away from a conversation with a prominent director who'd been discussing Arthur's communion with darkness as if it were a spiritual achievement. He made his way to a quiet corner, loosening his tie as anxiety clawed at his chest. The room suddenly felt overcrowded, the conversations too loud, the admiration too reminiscent of the cult-like following Croft had inspired. Overwhelmed, Eliza appeared beside him, offering a glass of water. "They're celebrating him," Arthur said quietly. "Not the film, not the craft, him. Everything you warned me about is happening." Eliza nodded, surveying the room with knowing eyes. "I expected this. It's why I brought them." She gestured subtly toward a group of women standing near the bar, families of the victims, their expressions solemn amidst the revelry. "I arranged for them to speak with some of the press here tonight, to make sure their perspective is part of the narrative around this film." Arthur felt a surge of gratitude for her foresight, her unwavering commitment to balancing the scales that his performance had threatened to tip. The evening wore on, a blur of congratulations and photo opportunities. Just as Arthur was preparing to make his exit, Melody appeared, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "There's someone who wants to meet you," she said, leading him toward a quiet room off the main space. A detective from LAPD's cold case unit. Inside, a middle-aged woman in a simple black dress introduced herself as Detective Lauren Reyes. "Your performance was unsettling," she said without preamble, "particularly for those of us familiar with the case." Arthur tensed, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I studied the records extensively." "That's just it," she interrupted. "There are details in your portrayal that weren't in any records, mannerisms that only survivors witnessed, ways of speaking that match prison recordings that were never made public." A chill ran through Arthur. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that 2 months ago, we reopened investigation into 3 unsolved cases from 1980, after Croft's arrest. Women killed in his style, but for which he couldn't be responsible because he was already in custody." She paused, studying his face carefully. "We now believe these were copycat killings, committed by someone with intimate knowledge of Croft's methods. Someone who might have been in contact with him." "The letters," Arthur whispered, remembering the correspondence he'd received during filming. "We've subpoenaed Croft's prison communications," Detective Reyes confirmed. "He's been corresponding with someone for years, someone who shared his interests, someone who may have carried on his work. And you think I might have inadvertently channeled this person through Croft?" The implications were staggering, not just that he'd inhabited Julian's persona, but potentially that of an unknown accomplice, or copycat, who remained at large. "We'd like your help," she said simply. "Your insights, based on your research and whatever. Connection you established with Croft's psychology." Before Arthur could respond, the door opened and Eliza stepped in, her expression making it clear she'd overheard at least part of the conversation. "Arthur, they're asking for you for the final toast," she said, her eyes conveying a warning he immediately understood. "I'll be in touch," he told Detective Reyes, accepting her card before following Eliza back to the party. "Whatever she's asking, don't do it," Eliza whispered urgently as they walked. "You've just started to find yourself again. Don't let them pull you back into his world." "But if I could help, at what cost? Your sanity? Your identity?" She stopped, facing him directly. "Arthur, you didn't just play him. For months you were him. You know that. I know that. If you go down this road—" She left the thought unfinished, but the implication was clear. The boundary between performance and reality, already blurred, might dissolve completely. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of conflicting emotions. By the time Arthur returned to his hotel room, it was nearly dawn. He sat on the edge of the bed, Detective Reyes's card in one hand, his phone in the other. On the screen was a new email notification, a message from San Quentin's public information officer. Julian Croft had granted his first interview in 15 years, scheduled to air the following week. The subject, Arthur's portrayal of him in Serpent. Arthur's finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. He opened the email, scanning the brief excerpt provided as a preview. "Mr. Reed didn't just play me," Croft was quoted as saying. "For a time, he became me. And once you've experienced that kind of freedom, that kind of power, can you ever truly go back? I don't think so. I think I'll always be with him now. A whisper in his ear, a shadow in the mirror." Arthur's phone slipped from suddenly numb fingers. The words were nearly identical to those he'd written in his private journal during filming, thoughts he'd never shared with anyone, not even Eliza. With shaking hands, he retrieved Detective Reyes's card and dialed her number. "I need to know something," he said when she answered, his voice steadier than he felt. "The copycat killings, when exactly did they stop?" A pause on the line. "The last confirmed case was in 1983. Why? And there's been nothing since? Nothing with the same signature?" "Not that we've identified," she replied carefully, "though we've had our suspicions about cold cases as recent as 5 years ago." Arthur closed his eyes, relief washing through him. He'd been born in 1988. Whatever connection he'd formed with Croft, whatever uncanny similarities had emerged in his portrayal, he couldn't possibly be the accomplice they sought. "I want to help," he said finally, "but on one condition. Eliza Mercer needs to be involved. She knows the victims, their stories. If we're going to do this, we need to remember what actually matters." After hanging up, Arthur moved to the hotel window, looking out at the Los Angeles skyline as the first light of dawn touched the buildings. In the reflection of the glass, he studied his face, searching for traces of Julian in his features, in his expression. For the first time in months, he saw only himself looking back. Arthur Reed, an actor who had ventured too deep into darkness but had found his way back, changed but intact. His phone buzzed with a text from Eliza. "Breakfast? We should talk about what comes next." What came next? Not just for his career, which would undoubtedly be transformed by the film's success, but for his journey of reclaiming himself from Julian's shadow, for the responsibility he now carried to the victims and their families, for the complicated partnership he'd formed with Eliza, built on shared trauma and mutual understanding. "Yes," he texted back, "I'm ready." As he prepared to leave the room, Arthur paused at the dresser where he'd placed Croft's letters in a sealed envelope. After a moment's hesitation, he picked it up and dropped it into the wastebasket. Julian Croft had become a legend on screen. But Arthur Reed had survived to tell a different story, one about the cost of art, the nature of evil, and the long journey back to oneself after walking in a monster's shoes. And as he stepped out of his hotel room into the bright California morning, Arthur knew with certainty that this was the story that truly mattered.